Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm super happy to introduce Nell Greenfieldboyce. When I first decided to make this seminar series, she was the first person I thought about. We need to get her here on campus. And all of you who are interested in science communication, I really urge you to listen to what she has to say, ask questions at the end. We will have time for questions. And also come to the lunch with Nell tomorrow, which is at the Forum at 11:30. So one of the things I really like about Nell's work is that she reports on science very broadly, from space through things very biological, including I've been privileged to work with Nell a couple times on little rats, which is always nice. And recently, last year, Nell published Transient and Strange, Notes on the Science of Life, which is a delightful read. And one of the things I really like about this book, and which I think we'll get a sense of from her talk, is how she intertwines her personal journey with the approach that she takes to scientific stories. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to her, and thank you for joining the Science Communication seminar series.
Thank you so much, Peggy. So just so I know who I'm talking to, so I'm not talking to just like a big bright light, how many people here are in the science communication program? So like a few. How many of you guys are science people? A lot of people, okay. And how many of you just like walked into this completely randomly and know nothing about what's happening here? Okay, so it sounds like you guys are slightly oriented. So I am really honored to be here. It's a delight. I've never been to the University of Chicago campus before, and I've been having a super fun time walking around talking to people about their research. And while I do that, I am listening to people and trying to find a story. So I guess the question becomes like, what is a story? And it would probably help if I had a little note here. I was like, wait, I had some notes. So I work for NPR, and if you had been listening to NPR on the morning of July 13th, you would have tuned in and heard me talking about ice worms, which are these little tiny worms that live in ice on top of glaciers. And if you think about it, that's a very strange thing to turn on your radio and hear about. Like, there's a lot of very important things happening in the news. And why would we inflict this on a national population? Like, why would we decide that of all the things in the universe that we want to tell people about as they're like going about their day, why are we talking to them about ice worms? It seems a little random, right? Because think about like all the people at this university in their laboratories doing science. Think about like all the science conferences happening, you know, the neurology, geosciences, you know, there's all the science journals. There's just like science, science, science happening everywhere. And out of all of this, we have plucked this one little story and are forcing everybody to listen to it. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask, like, why that one? Like, why ice worms, right? And then, on the other hand, sometimes you get this weird grouping of reporting where rather than being this sort of like one idiosyncratic thing that you're only hearing in one place, like suddenly ice worms, sometimes you turn on the news and it's like every news outlet is doing the exact same story on the same day and even using like the same images, right? And so like, what's that about? Like everybody's just moving in this herd, sort of. Although I will notice that NPR's is a little bit different. It's a little more skeptical because I told my editor, like, please, God, let us not do a headline that says we've detected life on a distant planet, right? So they're not all the same, but you know, it's pretty much like everybody's like following in this group. And so I think it's worth thinking about like, where these stories come from and why certain things get picked and certain things don't. And so just as an introduction to me, so I work for NPR. We do podcasts and radio stories, and we have print stories on our website. And I've worked for NPR for 20 years. And so I do stories for All Things Considered. I do stories for Morning Edition. These go on our national news programs. I do pieces for our science podcast, Shortwave, and I do pieces for our website. And so this is sort of where I work. It's the newsroom, and it's kind of like a casino in the sense that, like, anytime you walk in, day or night, it kind of looks just the same. Like, there's always people there. There's always, like, terrible food on a table somewhere, and, like, the news is just, like, 24/7, doesn't stop. And before I was at NPR, I worked for print magazines. So back in the day where we thought it was a good idea to get news by waiting a week for your news to be printed on dead trees and brought to your house, this is what I worked in. They sort of don't really exist in the same way anymore, although New Scientist does. So, I've basically been writing on science for 30 years, right? And then Peggy mentioned I just wrote this book, so this is my first book I ever wrote, and it was a weird experience to write a book. So, so for radio, for print magazines, for podcasts, and a book, 30 years of science writing in various forms, and I added it up recently. That's like 1,500 weeks, and if you do like a story a week, or probably more than that, thousands of stories. And so what I can tell you from this experience is that, as far as I can tell, typically speaking, you will find 5 different kinds of science stories in the national media, okay? I'm just gonna say 5. I probably could have come up with different categories, but 5, right? So let's count them down. The first kind of story is the story you do where you walk into the office and you expected to do something else that day, but something has happened. Does anybody know what this picture shows? It's debris from Space Shuttle Columbia that disintegrated over Texas. And some astronauts died. And so that was an unexpected event that just happened. And I would say that probably every science reporter in the country was immediately reporting on that. These types of events happen with no warning. There will be a submersible, is lost at sea, or COVID emerges, and someone's released anthrax, right? They're perhaps foreseeable in some way by people who've been warning of these things for years and years and years. In fact, they're usually foreseeable. But when they happen, they tend to happen just like, bam, here it is, clear your schedule for the day, because this is what you're now covering. And basically, it will shape science coverage because everybody feels like these are must-do, must-cover stories. And they're not always bad, but they usually are. Usually some sort of tragic event. And then there are other stories that are considered to do must-do stories. So does everybody know who this is, obviously? Some nods. This is Dolly, the famous sheep who was cloned from a somatic cell. I mean, this was a big scientific breakthrough, right? The first cloning of a creature from a somatic cell. And these types of like big breakthrough science are usually orchestrated by scientific journals or the universities or research institutions that put them out. So they don't happen suddenly. We usually get warning. We usually get like up to a week's warning that like on this day, you can release this previously confidential information. So like the possible signs of life on another planet, that was that kind of situation. There was a press conference, a bunch of reporters came, they said, you can release this information on this day. And so boom, all of a sudden you have all these outlets with seemingly the same news all at the same time. You have to cover these things if you're a science reporter because they're often like big advances, like discovery of the Higgs boson or, the first ever image of a black hole, right? Like they held a press conference where they showed this. And so if you're a reporter and somebody's going to show you the first ever picture of a black hole, chances are you're going to cover it. But it's not going to be like a real shocker. You've had warning, you were invited, you can make your plans, but what you get is seemingly the same coverage everywhere all at once. So those are the two categories where reporters are moving kind of in herds, right? Where you have these immediate sudden events, or you have kind of like big science breakthroughs that are kind of orchestrated by journals and institutions and that sort of thing. And then you have a few other categories of science news or science reporting that are more diverse. And so you won't see as much repeating. And one of this is a kind of story that I like to think of as sort of process of science. So it's like a story that reveals something about how scientists think and how science works. And so these are some flasks of bacteria that were put together by Richard Lenski in 1988. It's a long-running evolution experiment. And so he started out with identical bacteria in these flasks and then just watched them over the next 30 years. And so this is an ongoing experiment into evolution happening in real time. And this is an interesting thing because to me, it's an example of how scientists think, you know? It's like we normally think about how things evolve looking backwards, and Richard Lenski was like, well, let's look forwards, and we'll just have to do this simple thing, and you just do this simple thing over and over again every single day for decades, and you get interesting things like that A3. You notice one of the flasks is a little bit cloudier. It evolved this way of metabolizing a substance that was put in there actually as like a preservative. It wasn't even meant to be food. And it evolved how to metabolize this stuff. And then because they had saved samples going back, they could then use like all these molecular technologies to look at the genetic changes, using tools that didn't even exist back in 1988 when this thing happened. So, you can get a story that's kind of an interesting window into just the process of science and how science works. Then there's this other whole category of stories that is just like, isn't nature weird? Or like, I think often about the poor young people who are like strapped into the back seat of their cars while their parents are listening to NPR. And I feel like I have to give them something other than mortgage rates to listen to, right? Like they should hear something about an ancient squid or like a giant snowflake. In this case, this is the what's purportedly the largest single ice snow crystal. There's a lot of reporting that is like that. It's kind of like, just isn't nature weird kind of stories. And people like those, and so they're sort of a staple of science reporting. And then there's this final category I'll give you, which is science reporters more as watchdogs. So, I think that when people think of science communication, they often think of just kind of like explaining science or like, explaining science without the jargon. But, science reporters, just like other reporters, we see it as part of our job to push back against the powers that be that are making claims that sometimes are just manifestly false. This is a story I did after I got sick of listening to NASA officials just keep saying over and over again that we were going to land on the moon in 2024, when it was just like everybody in the space community knew that like there was no way we were going to land people on the moon in 2024. So the piece was about like, why do they keep saying this? And like, what are the political pressures they're under? And like, basically we've been saying we're going to land on the moon for, years and years. And, it's worth pointing out that the emperor has no clothes to a certain extent. I mean, this is a lot of reporting is somebody will say something and your job as a reporter is to point out that it is absolutely not true. And so this is something that my friend and colleague Michelle Nijhuis put together, which is the universal BS detector, which is basically, who's telling me this? How do they know it? Given 1 and 2, is it possible that they're wrong? If the answer is yes, it's possible that they're wrong, you find somebody else, another unrelated source, and you just repeat until you get as close as you can to what's probably actually going on. So just as an example of this in practice, Jared Isaacman is this billionaire space tourist traveler who went up in a SpaceX capsule. Do you guys know who this guy is? He's currently the head of NASA now. He was appointed by President Trump. Anyway, he proposed a private mission to spiffy up the Hubble Space Telescope. He was going to pay for it. And NASA investigated this, took it really seriously, and said they would study it, but then went kind of noticeably silent. And meanwhile, Jared Isaacman was going around saying that the reason they weren't letting him do this was because it was political. He said that, certain astronauts had been the only one to touch Hubble, and they didn't want anybody else to join their club, is basically what he was saying. And so I was just like, come on. And so I filed a Freedom of Information Act request and got a bunch of emails showing that actually NASA was quite concerned that he would break Hubble, which still has many years of usable life. And they had quite legitimate concerns. And, basically is an example of how, like, sometimes you just have to keep looking for another source, another person who will give you the insight that you wouldn't get from somebody who's trying to sell you something. This is another example. So this is the BP, the Gulf of Mexico, I guess we can still call it, oil spill. Do you remember this? So this was a really difficult thing to report on, seeing as how the events were happening beneath the Gulf of Mexico. It's like, how, as a reporter, do you find someone who's a reliable source who's not like mixed up in this whole situation? You have BP, who's got obvious interests of their own. You have the government that was supposedly regulating BP, which has obvious interests of their own. So at a certain point, they released some video of the oil spill from an underwater submersible. And my colleague, Richard Harris, had been waiting for them to do this and had lined up independent scientists who could look at video and basically calculate how much liquid was flowing out of a pipe based on the video. And based on that, he basically found that the amount of oil spilling out was at least 10 times the size of official estimates. And it was actually the biggest oil spill ever in the United States. And that was like a fairly significant piece of reporting. And note that BP had said repeatedly that there's no reliable way to measure the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico by looking at the oil gushing out. But scientists say there are actually many proven techniques for doing just that. So, if you don't want to be a stenographer, you have to look for the answers. And the answers are probably not going to come from somebody who's trying to tell you something. Sell you something, rather. So to get a story and to find out what's really happening, you have to talk to lots of people. And this is basically what my job is all the time. This is like all I do. I just sit there with people and I listen to them talk. And when you're listening to them, it's a very active process where you're trying to listen to what they're telling you, but also what they're not telling you. And a lot of people think that you're listening for information, and you are, but at least for me, a lot of the information I'm listening for is emotional information, because emotional information is what is going to connect people to the story I eventually produce. So the facts really are not that interesting, usually. I mean, they're very interesting to the scientists who work very hard on them. But for the average person who's just listening to my stories, when they're in the kitchen doing their dishes or driving around, they want the gist of it. And they want the gist to be accurate and not misleading. But you shouldn't confuse the facts for the story. The facts are not the story. And when I say that, it might make you think that, reporters are quite different than scientists. But I don't think that's true, actually. I think a lot of scientists have this real, inferiority complex, or this real concern that they're not able to communicate well, right? I hear this from scientists all the time. It's like, oh, we scientists, we need to do much better about communicating. It's really not my experience that scientists are unable to communicate their work. Just the contrary, actually. I find they're often passionate about what they're doing and are really good at communicating. And I think that there are a lot of things about reporters and scientists that they have in common. And so one thing is that we want the evidence. Like, we want the goods, right? Like, reporters want the pieces of paper, they want the documents, they want the hard numbers, and so do scientists, right? Both groups don't really have that much respect for authority, right? Like, it doesn't matter who you are. If you do not have the evidence, it does not matter. And in fact, I think that scientists and reporters both love nothing more than to take someone in a position of high prestige and prove them wrong in some way, right? That is really ideal from both of our point of views. I think that both groups of people want to find out the things that are real or hidden. And both groups have this sort of almost like religious fervor for it. So among scientists, you have the scientific method. Among reporters, we have the First Amendment and freedom of speech. We don't want to get scooped, right? Reporters and scientists both don't want to get scooped. And we both love elegance and beauty and poetry. And so there are all these commonalities, right, that I think make it really pretty easy for reporters and scientists to work well together. But there is one big difference, and that is I am not about promoting science. I mean, other people may be, but at least me as a reporter, I am not on the scientist's side. I have a different set of goals than the people I'm interviewing. And my goal is to get the story. And so sometimes the story is not what the scientists think it is. They think the story is about the work they're doing and their important discoveries, but to me, the story could be something completely different. And so that gets at this question of like, well, what is a story? So this is from Moby Dick. If you read Moby Dick, how many people here actually read Moby Dick? You were probably assigned it, right? Okay, there's a lot of information in there about the whale fisheries, right? Like some of it is fanciful, but some of it is like extremely accurate descriptions of hunting of whales, like getting the oil, like the anatomy of the whale, all of that. Is that the story of Moby Dick? Like, is that what makes people love Moby Dick and what draws people to Moby Dick? The story of Moby Dick is the story of this elusive white whale and Ahab seeking it to his own destruction, right? And this story has got characters, it's got movement, it's got conflict, and most importantly, it has universal themes. So even if you're never going to set foot on a whaling ship, there is something in this story that hopefully will resonate with you, that you can relate to by virtue of being a human being in the universe, right? So when I'm thinking about a story I'm reporting, there is always sort of two levels of the story. The one level is what the story is purportedly about, right? It's a story about whaling. And then there is the real story, the sort of meta story, which is the universal theme, right? And it's something that people can relate to even if they care nothing at all about the matter at hand. And this is really important for me because many, many times people do not care at all about the science at hand, right? It has no direct relevance to their life. It's not something they've thought about before, right? So you have to make it matter to them in some way. So does anybody know what this is? This is the LIGO. This is a detector for gravitational waves. So gravitational waves are ripples in space-time that happen when two big things smack together or go boom. So you could have two black holes colliding out in the universe. And that collision is so powerful that it literally shakes space-time. Think of space-time as being like jello. It creates these like movements, right, that literally stretch space and time. Like it literally moves. A very tiny amount, like less than, you know, the size of an atom, but it moves in a detectable way. And so Einstein had put these things out there, and he's like, they probably exist, but no one could ever detect them. And then over a period of years, people built these giant detectors. So there's two of these in the United States. And what this is it's at this corner station, there's a laser. They divide it in half, and they send each half of the laser down these 2.5-mile tubes. It hits a mirror on the other end, and then it comes back. And they're supposed to meet back at the corner. They're supposed to meet perfectly and be reintegrated together because they're the exact, each arm is the exact distance of the other. If a gravitational wave comes through here, rolls through the Earth, stretches space, the length of the arms will literally move. And so when light and the laser is racing down and then coming back, this device can detect that change in length of one of the arms, even if it's like a proton size, right? So they built these things to detect gravitational waves, and in 2015 they did, and it was a big science story, and we reported on it because it was in a major journal, and just like I showed you, like all crowds of reporters went and they basically reported the exact same thing, gravitational waves discovered for the first time, Einstein predicted it, now we've found it, yay, right? And that's fine as far as it goes, but there are other stories to tell about this too. So this is a guy, Corey Gray, and his mom. So Corey is a physicist, and he works at one of the detectors. And when they were putting the press release together on this, groundbreaking news, they translated it into all these different languages. They translated it into Russian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, all the different collaborators, all these major world languages. But Corey is from an indigenous community, the Blackfoot. And so he had his mom translate it into his indigenous language. And his mom actually is a survivor of the boarding schools where the federal government, in this case Canada, took all Native kids and brought them to boarding schools and basically punished them for speaking their own language. And so there are very few people who speak Blackfoot now. And she had to translate all these esoteric physical terms like general relativity and stuff into Blackfoot. She had to make up terms for them. And so, this is a story I told, and, it's ostensibly a story about, translating gravitational wave discoveries into Blackfoot. But it's really, the meta story is about this relationship between a parent and child. And it's a story about cultures being resilient even when someone's trying to stamp them out. And it's about passing on to your children the things that you hold dear that were given to you. And all of those things, are relatable to people who may not care about gravitational waves at all. Another example is I did this story. So this is Rich Isaacson. And he was just a federal employee at the National Science Foundation who there's this guy who won the Nobel Prize for the gravitational wave discovery work. And when I was talking to him, he was like, why should I have a Nobel Prize? He's like, so many people contributed to this. Rich was over there at the National Science Foundation, keeping them paying for this, even when we went years and years with no results, right? Basically this guy kept this thing going, for decades. Because he understood the science and he believed that it would work, and he was able to get everybody on board to keep pouring money into building these detectors when lots of people thought nothing was going to come of it at all, right? So again, the meta story here is you have a kind of anonymous person, a kind of person who's not famous, he's just working his day job, doing the best he can, trying to push things forward, not knowing if it's going to work. Maybe it won't work, but he's trying his best anyway. I think a lot of people can relate to that, right? That is a lot of people at their jobs feel like they're just banging their heads into a wall, right? So it's interesting to hear a story about somebody who did that. And you don't have to care about gravitational waves at all to be interested in hearing about that guy and how he managed to do that. This was a very popular story I did. So the headline for this story was "A Disturbing Twinkie That Has So Far Defied Science." And this was during the pandemic, and somebody put on Twitter that he had found these Twinkies in his basement. So he'd had these Twinkies in his basement for 8 years, and he went down there during the pandemic, and he went to eat one because he was desperate for dessert, and he pulled them out of the box, and this is what he found. And and then a guy who was really into mold asked him to send these, and they started analyzing them in the lab. So, you know, here it is. We're in the middle of like a national disaster, like we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and like I'm putting a story on our national news program about a moldy Twinkie. And, you know, my editor's like, I'm not sure this is a good, you know, like, why are we doing this again? I'm like, just trust me, people are going to love this. And they did love it, in part because of this picture, but it's because everybody has this idea of a Twinkie in their mind. And it's this kind of like golden, perfect sort of like icon of like youth and sweetness. And yet here it is. Look, it's like decayed and gone. And it taps into a lot of people's feelings at the time about like grappling with morality and grappling with everything kind of falling apart and like grappling with the fact that in the end, we are all just food for fungi, right? Like, I felt like this is a pretty dark story in a lot of ways for a story that is about a Twinkie. But there's a lot of depth to it. And so when I went into this story about a Twinkie, remember, it's purportedly about a Twinkie, I had already in my mind this like meta story. And so when I interviewed the scientists, I asked them questions designed to elicit quotes that related to this meta story. Do you know what I mean? And I talked to people for hours and hours, as I said, but in the end, my pieces are very short. They're like maybe 3 to 4 minutes. So like, how do you decide what details go in your finished piece? Because there's so much information, you can only put in a few little things. But once you know your meta story, it's easy. You put in all the details that reinforce your meta theme. I never had to say this Twinkie story is a story about facing mortality because it was obvious from every little detail and every little quote that I used, right? It makes it so much easier for you if when you're doing the piece, you have in your mind this like extra layer of story. It makes the choices clearer. Like I did another story about this piece of space hardware that in the 70s had been redirected to go chasing after a comet. And now this old guy had promised that he would eventually bring it back. And now it was 30 years later, and he was trying to get in touch with this old space hardware to put it back like he promised. And again, on the surface, it's a story about a piece of space hardware. Not everybody cares about circa 1970s space hardware, okay? But a lot of people have like older people in their lives. They think about getting older. They think about sort of like trying to reconnect with the past. Like, can you ever truly reconnect with the past, right? Like, that's a story that everybody can kind of relate to because it's a universal human theme. Like, I did another story about this returning material from an asteroid. It was going to be returned to Earth. And the whole piece was based around the primary investigator's dreams about it because he was like anxious about it. And so he was having anxiety dreams. And I think that like people can relate to that. Like even if you don't know what it's like to have material coming back from from an asteroid that's millions of miles away, you know what it's like to like lie awake at night and worry and to have these things get into your dreams. That's one of my favorite questions to ask scientists is whether their work ends up in their dreams. This is a story I did about science posters that my colleagues like made fun of me about. They're like, why are you doing stories on science posters? And I was like, well, because everybody's made a science poster. Like whether or not you're a scientist, like in grade school, you made a science poster. You know, you had to do your little science fair project. And this was a story about a guy who was trying to transform the way people were doing science posters because he thinks the scientific poster session is like basically a nightmare where nothing is really communicated very well. And so, again, the meta theme was like a hero battling against the forces that would, you know, thwart change and progress, right? But it was told through a science poster. And so again, this turned out to be a very popular story. And people would write and they'd be like, why are people interested in science posters? It's like, they're not interested in science posters. They're interested in the experience of trying to change something in culture that is sort of entrenched, so entrenched that nobody even questions it anymore. So let's bring this full circle. Why then were people forced to listen to something about ice worms? This is a fake book cover that a friend of mine made for me to mock me after my ice worm story. It wasn't one of those stories that was like orchestrated by a journal or a university. It was something that I came across fairly randomly because I had done a story on these things. These are little balls of moss. So they might look like moss-covered rocks, but they're not. They're balls of moss, like squishy, like spongy. And they appear on glaciers, like certain glaciers around the world. These things just show up. And glacier researchers call them glacier mice. And nobody really understands what's up with them. They've hardly been, they're not that common, and they're sort of funny, right? They're cute. They look like little critters or something. But I saw a study in Polar Biology, this journal, where somebody had tried to track their movements over time, and found that they were moving in very weird ways that the scientists couldn't explain, by things like the slope of the hill or the direction of the sunlight or something like that. So it was this like weird little mystery. And which just brings up another thing, which is that mysteries are almost always more interesting than answers. A lot of people feel like to do a science story, the scientists have to understand something, but it's really almost better if they don't. Because again, like, what are people listening to the story for? Is it for the information, or is it for the emotional resonance, right? And if it's for the emotional resonance, you don't need to know the answer. We don't know the answers for most things in life, but we live our lives and we find interest anyway, right? So I had done this story, which was popular, and one of the researchers who worked on this told me, if you like these things, you should do a story on ice worms. I was like, well, what are ice worms? He's like, they're little black worms that live up in glaciers on mountains, and they live deep within the ice. And then in the summer, they come up to the surface by the billions, and nobody knows why or what's going on with them. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe I could do that. So I was like, when are you going? He's like, oh, we'll go next summer, right? So it was like in my mind for almost a year that I was going to go do this story. And the reason I was drawn to it is this is a famous book, The Snow Leopard, by someone who went to Tibet, right? I think Tibet, with a scientist who was studying, I think, goats or something, but they were really trying to see if they could spot the snow leopard. And this is a famous book. It's kind of a meditation on mortality and life, and the author had just lost his partner who had unfortunately died. And so in his time of grief, he went on this long journey in the hopes of maybe seeing the snow leopard. And I thought to myself, the ice worms kind of reminded me a little bit of the snow leopard. Like, we're going to do a sort of poor man's snow leopard here, okay? So we're going to go on a journey. I'm going to walk with this guy. He's sort of like an ice worm evangelist. And as we walk up the mountain, trudging through the snow, because remember, I work for radio, so it's important to have sound, we're going to learn facts about, ice worms. But most of the facts is just me asking questions and them saying, like, well, we don't know, right? Because nobody knows. Like, what do they eat? We don't really know. Like, why are they black? We don't really know. Like, all these questions, like, how deep do they live? Well, we think, 30 feet, but we don't really know. And so basically my idea was that you would hear little bits and pieces, and you would go on this journey, and then at the end you would like see the ice worms. And my editor was really displeased by this idea when I came back and presented it to her. She felt like we needed to see the ice worms immediately. She's like, you've promised people ice worms. Like, I'm like 3.5 minutes into this story, and I still haven't seen an ice worm, and like, that's a problem. And I was like, no, this is like in Shakespeare where, you go for 3 acts and everybody's talking about the king, right? But you haven't met the king and you haven't seen the king. Like, you have to get invested in the king. And so then when the king actually shows up, they're like, ta-da, the king. Then you're like, oh, that you've heard about this person, and like, you're excited that the king has finally showed up. She's like, no, that does not fly on the radio. So we compromised. We had a brief sighting of one, which we portrayed as like a good sign of what was to come. Because when you get to the top, they sort of all come out en masse, and that's just like trying to show you a picture of it. They just all kind of suddenly appear. You know, you're up there on the mountain and you're looking at all these peaks, and like all these worms start like just crawling out, and they're just kind of like everywhere, like not making any attempt to blend in whatsoever, doing their secret, you know, worm things. And it was like this great moment of reveal, right? Like here we are on this mountain that people in a major metropolitan area are looking at all the time. And like little do they know that up here there's this like, you know, like if you go to the visitor center at Mount Rainier, they've got this whole like wildlife display with like Arctic foxes and stuff. Like they don't even mention ice worms, even though ice worms are like, what else is alive up there? Nothing, you know, the place is just covered with ice worms. Anyway, people loved this story. And the question is, why would people love a story like this? And I think that the answer is that that it is this grand, mysterious thing that is little known and could disappear because the glaciers are melting. And, you know, does that sound like at all familiar to you? Like, to me, it sounds like me. Like, I feel that I am grand and mysterious and little known, and I will at some point disappear. And I think, like, to me, this is like why I named my book Transient and Strange, because people have always been drawn to the transient and the strange. So this is a painting by Frederick Church of 1860, and this is a portrayal of a real event that happened. It was a procession of meteors. So a piece of a meteor came in and broke up in the atmosphere, and so you had this line, this trail of meteors, which is kind of an unusual thing. And 1860, that was before the Civil War, and this was a huge news event. So it was all over the news. If I worked back then, I would have reported on this. People were talking about it. A painter painted it. Walt Whitman wrote about it. He wrote, in Leaves of Grass, he wrote, "Year of comets and meteors, transient and strange, lo, even here one equally transient and strange. As I flit through you hastily, soon to fall and be gone, what is this book? What am myself but one of your meteors?" So I would just urge you, when you're communicating science, if that's what you do, or if you're a scientist, don't think about the science. Think about the person who's going to be getting the information, and think about what would be appealing to them on a human level that has nothing to do with the science, and use that. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to take questions.
Hi. Thanks for the great talk. I think one of the major criticisms that I always see of science journalism is journalists who don't really understand the science, who then kind of blow up like either a minor discovery, or like, I think especially in the behavioral sciences, if a study is done on like 30 people and then when the journalist picks the story up, it becomes this massive overgeneralization. What are your thoughts on how to combat this in science communication?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think a lot of times some people think that that science journalists exaggerate things, but I think that if they actually looked at the situation, sometimes they might find it's the scientists doing the exaggeration. Just as an example, like the recent hints of life on planet K2-18b, that I was pretty skeptical about, but got a lot of coverage initially, that I think made the public think that like we've discovered life on another planet, right? Like, I think astronomers were pretty dismayed at how that whole thing went down, and were pretty distressed that the public had gotten the wrong idea that this pretty small bit of evidence that may not even have been there had blew up into this, you know. But really, honestly, from what I observed, the reporters were just accurately reporting what the scientists said. And, you know, you hope that they would go and find other scientists to talk to who would do things like point out the small study size or whatever. I mean, that's what we did. But even when you do that, sometimes you end up with these headlines that can be misleading, right? Like maybe in the story you see all the cautions, but the headline, you know, looks gives a different message, right? I mean, I think that there are some scientists who, like, they're really enthusiastic about their work, and you can understand that. And, they say the caveats, but maybe not with the same enthusiasm that they reported their findings. But as far as, like, how a scientist can prevent a journalist from taking their research and spinning it into something it's not, I mean, I think that I think a scientist should be careful about what journalists they talk to, first of all. Like, I think it's a good thing to do a little Google search and find out, like, what other stories this person has done. But I think that you also can just say, like, you can just address it, like, very frankly, and say, like, you should not write a headline saying X, Y, and Z. Like, I'm not saying X, Y, and Z. But the fact of the matter is, scientists often do say X, Y, and Z. They say, X, Y, and Z. Now we have to replicate this, and there's some cautions, but X, Y, and Z. And, I mean, I'm not making excuses for reporters, but they're only one part of the system, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Is it okay if I don't use a mic? So, what if there were unacknowledged classified programs that prevented such knowledge from being shared? How would one go about communicating these thoughts and ideas with the greater intellectual community?
If work was classified, so I think that someone would have to break the classification. So, I mean, you'd need a whistleblower, really. I mean, if something's, like, actually classified, yeah, I mean, definitely classified material gets out into the public all the time. Sometimes people even put it on Signal and send it to reporters, like at the Atlantic. There are, I mean, there's obviously consequences for talking to a reporter about classified material, but, it is an interesting, like, it is always, I have a professional interest in how information flows around. Do you know what I mean? Like, who keeps information and how it gets out and how it gets disseminated. And the classification system is a particularly worrisome one for reporters because and for sources because of all the legal implications. Like, they could literally, like, throw you in jail. But they're even beyond the classification system. There are people who put their jobs at risk to talk to reporters, and there are reporters who keep their mouths shut and go to jail because they won't reveal their sources. So, it's a vexed business, the business of information, getting it out. I will say that that's not usually what most reporters are dealing with most of the time. Like, we are just inundated with people trying to send us press releases, and, if you have the ear of millions of people, like, everybody wants to sell you their version of some story, like whether it's a nonprofit or an academic institution or a company or a politician or whatever. Like, they're just, like, constantly, like, inundating you with their vision of reality that they want you to share unquestioningly with the world at large. So, yeah, it's kind of like it's a little much sometimes.
Thank you. I first have to acknowledge that I now feel compelled to go and listen to the Twinkie story, because when I first came to the United States, I was told that they were made of petroleum, they would never go moldy, and that you couldn't eat them.
Yeah.
Well, now I need to know more.
45 days. Like, I think their official shelf life is 45 days, but yeah, most people think they're immortal. Yeah.
Well, my question is about something else, though. So, when you described how, finding a relatable story is most important part of science journalism. From your examples, some of the examples, like with a gravitational waves detector, it seems like the story is almost superimposed on the science, in the sense that the dying languages story, or is almost like tangential to the science story, whereas for other stories, I assume it's different. Particularly, I'm wondering if you do have examples of stories where you cared really in a particular way about the accuracy of science that was being communicated, or whatever amount of science is being communicated. But even if it's very few facts, like where the story was really important to the science that was being communicated, or not.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I care about the facts. I just think that that to make them attractive and to keep people with you through the facts, it's almost like you have a Christmas tree, and like the Christmas tree is the story, and the facts are like the little decorations. You're sort of slipping them in, on a need to know basis. So that if someone listens to it, they may think they're listening to a story, but they're actually absorbing a lot of scientific information. It's just presented in a way that makes it more, it's not just like, here's a big chunk of information. Like, here's a lot of, here's your, nutritious granola of science facts. Like, get eating, right? No, it's like, you want to make them like a little sundae, and you sprinkle the granola in. But I mean, definitely there's different types of journalism, and people do different things, right? This is just my thing. This is what I like to do. Some people just do like straight, like the AP news reporting, like the sort of traditional reporting where it's just like facts, 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 facts. And like you can cut from the bottom because like the stuff at the bottom isn't very interesting, isn't as important, right? People do that kind of reporting all the time. The stories I do, if you cut the bottom, you would lose a lot of the meaning of the story because it's all kind of worked together. But I mean, the science has to be right. Like, to me, that's just kind of like a given, right? Like, you're not going to get very far in journalism if you're screwing up the science when you present this stuff. But I think people need less of it than scientists think. Like, I did a story about antimatter, and about, it was in Nature, it was very technical. The paper was a lot of equations. They had generated antimatter and probed it with a laser to see how antimatter would respond to light. And it responded to light in the way that they had predicted. That's really all you need to know. Like, believe me, the scientist I talked to told me about this experiment in great detail, right? But like, for me as a reporter, it's like I have to think like, what do people know about antimatter? It's like they know like Star Trek. They know like the antimatter engine and in whatever. So I'm going to start with that. I'm not ashamed to use a movie clip if it's going to like get people into it. And then, I had the scientist talking about like the first time he ever heard about antimatter. He was a kid, he saw it on Star Trek, and then like he went into physics and was surprised to learn that it was like a real thing. And then he was saying like the main thing you need to know about it is that if it touches matter, it disappears. And he's like, that's why my life as a scientist is a nightmare. It's because every time I generate this stuff and try to study it, it disappears, right? So like all the information I kept was what he would think of as the unimportant stuff, right? Like his experiences as a child, like his emotional reactions, like anything that's a little funny. And like the amount of actual science that was in the piece, for my purposes, was pretty little. But if it was a piece going in Scientific American, or if it was a piece going in the news section of, Nature or something, it would be much more technical. They would want to know like what kind of laser and for how long, and what exactly it did. But my listeners they don't care about that. I don't think.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask a question about any advice or examples about when the story that you have in mind doesn't necessarily play out in an interview. So maybe if you have this really interesting, like overarching narrative that you want to tell, but then the second you talk to an expert and have a conversation with them, you start to realize that maybe your story is not the story. So I was wondering, how do you know when to pivot? And when that occurs, how do you pivot?
It's a good question because, you're there to report on how reality is, not to just like superimpose your preordained vision of how things are going to be, right? I do think it helps to go into it with at least an outline of what you think will happen because it helps you plan. So just for some reason, the example that comes into mind isn't a science one at all. It's a colleague of mine who was reporting on the funeral of James Brown, right? And so he was like, okay, I'm going to report this story. And he's like planning to do it. And he's like, I'm going to have it's going to be in 3 parts so that we can have movement through the piece. I'm going to have like the waiting for the coffin, and I'm going to have the seeing the coffin, and I'm going to have like after the coffin, right? So he had this whole plan, and he got there, and like he got the first part, and then like there was just this huge line, and like there was no way he could get in. And so he had to just like completely change his plan, right? So you have to change. Like, you think it's a story about somebody trying to reconnect with their past, and then you go talk to him, and like all he's talking about is the future, then you can't just like shoehorn this in. It's not going to work. And I think that, it's like trying things on for size. It's like a hypothesis. It's like you think it's like this, and so you go and you like test it out. And is it resonating? Does it seem like it fits? No, it doesn't. It feels forced, right? So then like what is there? Do they say something else that's interesting? Like maybe, I've definitely interviewed people and I thought it was going to be about one thing, and then they'll say something else. Like that guy with his like his asteroids and his dreams. Like I didn't go into that thinking I was going to do a story about, his dreams of asteroid failure. But I asked him, I was like, do you ever dream about this stuff? He's like, oh yeah, I have the most vivid dreams. And just started talking to me about that. And I was like, all right, we're doing this. Like I'm shifting now. Cause like that's more interesting. I think a good clue is like paying attention to kind of your own emotional responses. Like if you're kind of zoning out, or like if you don't feel engaged, chances are your audience isn't going to feel engaged either, So like, and also like, you can kind of tell when people go on autopilot, right? Like, I remember a colleague of mine wanted to talk to a scientist about, it was like the genetics of some weed or something. And he met him, and the guy immediately opened up his like laptop and was going to show him a PowerPoint. And my friend was like, oh, this is going to be deadly. And he was like, the guy started his PowerPoint and was like, it's a very common weed. And so my friend was like, how common? He's like, oh, it's very common. It's everywhere. He's like, could we go outside right now and find it? And the guy's like, probably. He's like, okay, let's do that. Let's go outside and go find it, right? Like if what you're doing is not feeling good, like try something different, right? Like ask an off-the-wall question, or like get them to go somewhere else. Get them to walk and talk. Walking and talking is usually better. Driving, people say great things when they're driving. It really helps a story if you're like doing something in the story, like describing action, is often better than just like, it gives some movement and momentum already before you've even added anything else into it. You don't want just like people sitting there talking at each other. That can be okay too, but they better be talking about something pretty interesting. And anything any trick you can do to get anybody to emote about anything, like I ask people like, well, what do what do your family think about this? Or, what I mean? Just like questions that they're not going to get in a job interview. Do you know what I mean? Like something that makes them reveal themselves a little bit. Doesn't have to be much. You don't need to like plumb the depths of their psyche, but just like making them a little bit more than just like anonymous scientist person, I don't know. I'm not sure that's very helpful.
I had another question regarding science and meta stories. So I noticed that when a lot of people open articles, they kind of are captivated by the science and like the human part comes out later. So when you're thinking about like headlines and captivating your reader, how do you kind of balance like what to prioritize in those first like couple sentences or even the headliner itself?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a different like writing, I mean, you could do a whole like, semester-long class on the difference of writing for different formats, right? I mean, definitely radio lends itself more to these sort of like universal human stories because like you're hearing people talking and you're hearing their voices, and through voices people are trying to make a connection. I think it's possible when people are reading like the newspaper, they're wanting something different. I don't know. I mean, like the piece about hints of life on this other planet, like a lot of places just portrayed it straight as like scientists have detected hints of life on another planet, like period, right? And my feeling about it was they say they've done this, but to me this is just a harbinger of like we're just going to hear this more and more in the years ahead as people are using these telescopes to find things about distant planets, and so what are we to make of it, kind of thing. I feel like sometimes just playing it straight can almost be misleading in a way, because again, because usually the caveats get pushed way down to the bottom. It's like you let the scientists have their say, and then you line up all the critics or the caveats or whatever. But it can send the wrong message, right? So in some ways, it's better to do a story that's like a little, comes at the issue a little more sideways, because it makes it opens up space to be less definitive about like, scientists have discovered this thing that's very important and we should all accept it immediately. If you do something a little more focusing on like some aspect of it that's, I'm not expressing this very well. Like, I would be looking for another way to cover it. Like, I'm just thinking about, like, there was this very famous Martian meteorite that there was this claim that someone had found microfossils in it, right? Like, people were like, oh, we found like this was years ago, right? But it was one of these early examples of like people saying, oh, we found signs of life in a Mars rock. And I was just like, no, you didn't, right? But everybody like covered it, except for I remember one guy in the Washington Post, he covered the press conference, and he covered it like as a participant in the press conference. And he started out by pointing out that like NASA was having trouble getting the microphones and audiovisual to work, right? Like it was just a little detail. It was just like, NASA's trying to announce like, life on Mars, and like the microphones aren't working. Do you know what I mean? And so it was a funny way of doing it, because like right from the beginning, he's like casting doubt on this whole situation, right? Like if they can't even get the microphones to work, how do you know about the fossils? And also it was just like, it put you there, right? It put you there in the moment. It like was treating you as like a participant in this thing, right? Like pulling back the curtain and showing that this was an orchestrated event, that NASA had brought all these reporters here and was like presenting this. And so it opened space in the story for you to see it in a new way. Not that it was like this scientific discovery, but that it was a claim being made at an orchestrated event where like maybe the people didn't quite have their stuff together. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so I thought that was very clever. And, you know, I think that it's possible to do that kind of reporting more, where you are reporting on the events, but less portraying them as things that are sort of like apart from human activity and human frailties, and they're created events. Like, so many things reporters cover are manufactured events, and you should just be straight about that.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. We've seen, and it's been detailed at length in the media and everywhere else, the sort of growing, deepening skepticism of science in society. How do we go about starting a different conversation where we get, people to understand, how do we tell a better story as science people, whether it be in the academy, whether it be in, government scientists or whoever is trying to tell a story, to get people to, believe and even just get away from some of the automatic skepticism. I mean, is it just too far gone?
I don't know. I like I said, I've been in this business a long time, and there has always been skepticism of science, and there's always been targeting science for political reasons. Like, I remember some people who studied water quality and seafood fisheries. And they were mocked for having like shrimp on a treadmill. It's like, what? Our tax dollars are going to people who build treadmills for shrimp. You know what I mean? Like, they're just completely mocked and, treated like their work was like trivial and stuff. And, I was just thinking about like back to the days of Reagan saying that like, trees pollute, right? Like, do you remember that? Like, he was saying like trees release more pollution than factories do or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I do think like in there with the sort of the ease of disinformation and misinformation out there, that we are in a new, like, I'm not trying to make light of this. I think there is kind of like a new era, but I think there has always been, anti-academic, like, threads throughout history in the United States, and skepticism about so-called experts. There's always been, alternative medicine, people saying that, pharmaceutical companies are trying to kill us in various ways, and, skepticism about genetically modified organisms. Like, you could just go on and on. And so definitely, some of this stuff is troubling. I mean, I don't see my job as promoting science, so I guess I don't think about these in the same way as other people's do. I mean, I do think I promote critical thinking and verifiable facts. So yeah, I don't know. I get this question a lot, and I have no good answer to it. I don't really know what to say. I'm sorry that's so unsatisfying. I mean, I report on scientists like I would report on anybody else, and I regard scientists as human just like anybody else, and they're subject to their own biases and their own prejudices and their own, they say things that aren't true, and they, I mean, I've reported on some real characters, so it's hard for me to sort of exalt science. But there is something special about the scientific method, and I'm not sure the public disagrees with that. It's just like my own profession, journalists, we are, like, everyone hates us. No one trusts journalists. Do you know what I mean? And yet everybody's getting their news from journalists all the time. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to, like, I guess so, but, I don't know, like, yeah, and like all the, I don't know how many people in this room even read newspapers or, Like I was talking to high school students and it was all like YouTube and TikTok. And so, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like everything I know is useless. But what I do know is that people like stories. That I believe that since the days that we were living in caves around campfires, people like stories, and they will always listen to stories. And that is never going to go away. I believe that is something primal in us.
Last question. Uh-oh, that's some heavy stuff. I agree, people like stories. I get paid to listen to stories. I'm a psychiatrist. And when I'm listening to your story, I'm really curious because, I have a family that loves sports. I hate sports. But they know if I'm going to watch a sports game, I can get really into it as long as they give me human interest. So when I listen to you talk about science, why science for you? Because you could be reporting on anything.
Yeah, I could be reporting on anything. It's true. And in fact, I have. Like, I've reported on sports. Like, I've reported on ski jumping and stuff. I worked for a magazine, and we had to do, we all had to take a turn covering the Olympics. And, then later I did some story on something, and someone wrote into me, it's like, you have this, Nell Greenfieldboyce reporting on science. Like, oh, she's a sports reporter. I'm like, really? All right. It wouldn't have to be science. It's just where I ended up. Partly because I was a failed scientist. I was going to be a scientist, and I was looking around for something else to do. And my college, much like this place, had a science communication program. And then by taking that program, I realized that all this stuff that I had been kind of consuming my whole life related to science, like magazines and books and documentaries and stuff, it just suddenly occurred to me that people have jobs making that stuff. I was like, oh, I could make that. My parents wanted me to be a scientist, but I wasn't going to be a scientist. I wanted to be a writer, but it was regarded as a ridiculous thing that you're going to be a writer. They're like, you have to get a job. So it's like, yeah, I'm going to be a science writer. It's my. And weirdly, I have so many journalist friends who've been laid off over the years, and weirdly, it's been specializing in something. It makes you a more marketable person in a way. Like journalists are just being, laid off right and left. But if you specialize in something, in some ways it would seem to narrow things for you, but actually it opens more opportunities for you. Because you can build yourself as a brand, or something about science. I don't know anything about science, just from reporting, from watching it. But yeah, it could be anything. I report on lots of stuff. I have a friend who, she's a reporter, and she also works for this little news weekly put out by her neighborhood, and she runs a little column in it called Commercial Strip Confidential. And what she does is she reports on all, how there's always a storefront that's weirdly empty, or just I don't know, you see the police outside and you're like, what's with this place? Is this a front for a drug business or whatever? Anyway, she reports on that. And she's just a really talented investigative reporter, and she's applying all these skills to these really tiny, she'll call all these people and they'll be like, who are you again? What are you reporting for? It's Commercial Strip Confidential. So yeah, you could do anything, report on anything. But science it speaks to something in me that I think sports wouldn't. But I don't know, maybe I'll turn to sports. We were just talking about what I should do next. Maybe I'll be a sports reporter.
Nell, thank you so much.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you so much.